He had not watched television since he had heard the news from Teddy and Hyannis, and had only briefly glanced at the paper that morning. I suppose there was nothing more for him to know. His son was gone, and the morbid details did not concern him. The room was blanketed in the soft shadows of twilight, and we sat together in silence. The next morning he refused his breakfast and would not get out of bed. We sat together watching the clock in silence. The hands limped the minutes away, and finally the hour came. I took his rosary from the nightstand and laid it in his hand. I pulled my chair near his bed. His eyes were closed, and his face was granite in its composure. "Shall I say the rosary, Mr. Kennedy?" He nodded faintly. So it was while a nation watched their president laid to rest with fitting pomp and ceremony. His father prayed alone in a still and near deserted house. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jessica Nell, and if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription today. Well, we are in our Kennedy weeks that we are doing over spring break 2025. And this new series that we started last time is going through the book of Rita Dallas, RN. It's called The Kennedy Case. It says the intimate memoirs of the head nurse to Joseph P. Kennedy during the last 8 years of his life. And last time, so this is them, this is Mrs. Dallas with Joseph Kennedy. She was his personal nurse. And last time we got to see the playing out of that tragic day when John F. Kennedy was assassinated from the perspective of Hyannis. And we got an up-close look at various Kennedy family members, the order of the day, how various people in the household found out before the family. And then we got to see through the eyes of this head nurse the ways that Mrs. Kennedy and Mr. Kennedy were informed about their son's death. So now we are going to read chapter 18, which her book started with John F. Kennedy's assassination, but then she walked through her years with Mr. Kennedy as his nurse, and she tells various family stories and things like that. We are just getting some highlights from the book this read through. And so we are going to go to chapter 18, which is the morning after the assassination. However, I noticed there's a little paragraph that sort of gets us back into the mode and helps us understand her perspective. So we're going to read that and then get into chapter 18. When President Kennedy was shot, not only did the United States lose a president, but Caroline and John lost a loving father. The other grandchildren lost a fun-loving Uncle Jack. Eunice lost an energetic and admiring companion. Jean and Pat, a strong brother. Teddy and Bobby lost their closest friend. Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy lost a son who had filled their dreams and quiet moments, and the First Lady lost her husband. I thought of them all that long night while I stayed with Mr. Kennedy, and I remembered President Kennedy's last words over and over. Take care of Dad until I get back. Chapter 18. The morning after the assassination was full of the dull pain of an unbearable loss. We were all emotionally drained after the shocking intrusion of his death, and the realization was beginning to seep into us that a vital, loving man was suddenly no more. But somehow our work went on, and my full attention was on Mr. Kennedy. He had been told the night before that his son was dead, and he had not slept well. He was awake very early, and I wondered how he was going to face this day. It was always his custom to have a glass of juice and read the morning paper before breakfast, and I knew I had no right to break his routine, but when I brought the paper in with the dreadful news, I did not want to offer it to him. I laid it on the dresser, hoping that he would not ask for it. The headlines were horrifyingly vivid, and the reporters were having a field day speculating on the assassination and the family's reaction to it. He drank his juice and then, much to my despair, motioned for the paper. He looked at the headlines, read for several minutes, then slowly laid his head back on the pillow and listlessly brushed the paper off his bed and onto the floor. There had been no conversation between us. When I brought his juice, I said good morning, but nothing more. I did not move around the room, but sat quietly in a chair near his bed and waited. I looked at the front page of the paper, which had fallen face up on the floor. Edged in black was a large picture of the president, and I stared at it, almost transfixed, for it seemed impossible that he was dead. Utterly impossible. I looked back at Mr. Kennedy and saw that he had gripped the sheet in a tight knot. His eyes were closed and 2 tears ran down his cheeks. I turned off the intercom and said, "Mr. Kennedy, I'll be outside the door if you should need me." He did not open his eyes or make a sound. He gave a small nod of his head as I put the rosary in his hand and left him alone. There are moments of grief that cannot be shared, and by the nature of their intensity, must be suffered alone. Mr. Kennedy needed time to grieve alone. It was his right, as a man and as a father. I waited outside his door until Dora brought up his breakfast. I took it into him, but he turned his face away. All morning long, his eyes stared straight ahead into nothingness. He took his medication in a listless way and became more withdrawn as the morning passed. He seemed emotionally frozen. Father Kavanaugh had come to be with him, but apparently the grief and shock had been too severe for him, and he had gone to bed under doctor's orders. Anne, too, had collapsed and was under sedation. Mrs. Kennedy, on her way to and from Mass, had looked in on her husband, but did not disturb him. Teddy and Eunice had not come in, but Mrs. Kennedy said they would see him after lunch. "There's so much to do," she said, "and they're taking care of it for me. So many friends are calling, and I simply can't talk to them, so they're doing it." I brought in his lunch, and he paid no attention to it. He simply stared straight ahead. I returned the tray to the desk in the nurse's station and sat down for a moment, trying to decide what I could do. He was a helpless man who had lost a son, but even more, he was a man yet to be comforted by his family, yet to be told anything except that his son had been murdered. Old friends were being talked to, but the father of the slain man had lain for hours with hardly a word of condolence. I knew he could not be allowed to withdraw further into himself, so I made a decision. I went back into his room and stood at the foot of the bed. "Mr. Kennedy," I said. He gave no indication that he heard me. "Mr. Kennedy, I must talk to you, and I know you can hear me." His eyes never moved from their fixed stare. "People all over the world are wondering what this will do to the president's father," I said. "Will he have a heart attack?" they're saying. "Will he give up? Will it be too much for him?" Now, Mr. Kennedy, you and I both know that you're a tough Irishman who knows how to fight back. So fight, Mr. Kennedy, fight hard. Come downstairs and be with the rest of your family. They need you. Bobby and the girls are in Washington with the First Lady, and Teddy and Eunice are here to stay with you and Mrs. Kennedy. So think how hard this is on them, and if you give up, so will they. Mrs. Kennedy needs you. Teddy and Eunice need you. So if you have any strength left, give it now. Don't let them down, Mr. Kennedy. For their sake and yours, don't let them down. Mr. Kennedy? Slowly he raised his left hand and motioned for me. I walked around his bed and stood beside him. He reached for my hand and clamped it in a vice-like grip. He raised it to his cheek and gave a long, agonizing cry. "I'm going to wait outside, Mr. Kennedy. I'm going to turn the intercom back on so I'll be able to hear if you decide you want to go downstairs." I took my hand away, and as I left the room, I said, "It's up to you, Mr. Kennedy. It's all up to you." It was nearly 10 minutes before he called, and it was a long wait for me. When I finally heard him, I wanted to dash back into the room, but instead I went in normally and said, "What is it, Mr. Kennedy?" He motioned to his wheelchair. "Do you want to go downstairs?" He nodded yes. He pointed to his robe and slippers and helped while I put them on him. In his paralyzed condition, dressing could be quite difficult if he decided not to cooperate, but that morning he assisted me in every way he could. I did not call for help to get him into his wheelchair, but said, "Let's see if we can do it on our own, Mr. Kennedy." He nodded his head firmly and made every effort he could to get himself from the bed to the chair. In just a few minutes, he was ready, and when I followed the usual custom of handing him a mirror in order for him to see himself, he brushed it aside. We went downstairs, and Teddy was in the sunroom. We found him sitting on the arm of a chair, staring moodily through the window at the flag flying at half-mast. He was startled when he heard us, but he put on a wide smile and said, "Why, Dad, I didn't realize you'd be coming down today." Mr. Kennedy gave no answer but pointed outside. "What do you want, Dad?" Mr. Kennedy pointed outside again and jabbed his finger for emphasis. "Do you want to go out?" Teddy asked. "Is that it?" Mr. Kennedy nodded his head yes, and made a rambling diagram in the air with his finger, which we all knew meant that he wanted to take a ride. "Get him ready, Mrs. Dallas," Teddy said, "and I'll go warm up the car." I did not want to put him through the ordeal of dressing, so I merely wrapped a heavy blanket around him and put on his little beret. We waited inside the front door until Teddy drove up. He jumped out of the car and took his father's wheelchair. Without help, he bundled him in the front seat, then opened the back door for me. The car was warm. I just have to say, it's kind of a dangerous place to get, isn't it? Into the back seat of Teddy Kennedy's car. The car was warm, and Mr. Kennedy settled down as his son put the chair in the trunk. When Teddy got behind the wheel, he reached over and laid his hand on his father's shoulder. "Okay, Dad, which way do you want us to go?" Mr. Kennedy first pointed us to the Hyannis airport, and we knew that he wanted us to check on the Caroline. When we arrived, Teddy explained why the plane was not there. "Captain Baird will be back this afternoon, Dad, and he'll be on standby the rest of the time. I thought maybe I'd go back to Washington late tonight if it's okay and come right back." His father nodded his approval and was very explicit in his directions after we left the airport. We drove to Bass River, taking all the back roads, and during the whole ride there was no talk of the assassination, nor did Teddy ever force conversation. He spoke about the weather and of spending Christmas in Florida. He told his father about some of the boat races he had won during the summer and mentioned that he wanted to buy the house next door to Bobby's in order to be able to live on the compound. "The man won't sell it, Dad, and I'm sure disappointed." They talked of other things, and we drove for more than 3 hours that day, going up and down the back lanes until Teddy finally slowed the car and said, "Dad, I'm lost. You'll have to help me find my way home." Mr. Kennedy smiled for the first time, faintly, and pointed out the directions. Through all the twists and turns, he never lost us once. I have no way of knowing whether Teddy was lost or whether he felt merely that his father needed the reassurance that he was still the one they depended on. But Teddy did have a notoriously bad sense of direction. Oh my goodness. And helping his son find his way home helped prevent a dangerous withdrawal by Mr. Kennedy. Life would go on, and he was given a sense of his importance to his family by this simple act. Yeah. I don't know if you caught my reaction, but one of the theories of Chappaquiddick is that Teddy thought he had gone the opposite way away from the cottage where they were staying, and that he was going around towards the ferry, and failed to recognize that the turn that he was taking was not onto a dirt road that would lead them to the ferry, but onto the dirt road that led to Dyke Bridge. So that was my laughing about his bad sense of direction, is that actually that's one of the theories about how they went off of Dyke Bridge. But additionally, I just wanted to say there are a couple of things here where the nurse is appealing to the crucial role that the father had in their family, and that's what she uses to call him out. And then Teddy is also doing that. So they all must have known psychologically that was the thing that he needed in order to kind of get up out of bed and get going, and also interact there in the car. I'm sure Mr. Kennedy kept us out on such a long ride in order to tire himself, but by the time we returned to the compound, he was worn out. Teddy helped me get him to his room, and he was very passive when we put him to bed. He was soon fast asleep. While he was napping, Mrs. Kennedy sent for me. Teddy had told her about taking his father for a ride, and she said, "I know it's been hard on you, Mrs. Dallas, for none of us have been any help, but thank you for taking care of my husband. We mustn't let him get in the shape he was when we lost Joe. My husband is a strong man, but when something hurts him, he withdraws. He never wants to show a weakness, but this kind of pride can destroy him as ill as he is. Getting him out today was a miracle, and I thank you for it." While she was talking, I noticed 2 black mourning veils laid on her bed. One was full and quite heavy, the other rather delicate and somewhat ornate. "I wanted to ask your opinion," she said. "You're a widow, so you might know which veil I should take to the funeral." She gave a dry laugh and continued, "I'm wearing the same dress I've had in the closet in case Mr. Kennedy died. How ironic it is that I'll be wearing it to Jack's funeral. We never know, do we, Mrs. Dallas?" "No," I said. "Life gives us no assurances." She fingered the sheer veil, then looked at the heavy one. "My husband and children always want me to look right, so which one do you think will be best, Mrs. Dallas?" "Mrs. Kennedy," I said, "you're going to be very much in the public eye during all of this. And if you want to shed a few tears behind the veil, then I believe if I were you, I would wear the heavy one." She touched first one, then the other. She looked up at me with deep pain in her eyes and sighed. "Perhaps I should take them both." When I saw the pictures taken at the funeral, she was wearing the heavy veil, and I grieved for her in her terrible loss. Word started coming in regarding the funeral, and an important decision had to be made. Would Mr. Kennedy attend? Eunice and Teddy were the only two of the children who had been staying at the compound, and they left only for brief flights to their brother's beer. Otherwise, they remained with their parents. The rest of the children were in Washington, assisting the First Lady with the unimaginable details that confronted her. Either Eunice or Teddy went to Mass with their mother, and almost hourly family prayer sessions were conducted in the home. As the hours passed, more information regarding the funeral came in, and when we learned of the long walk involved, everyone felt that it would be impossible for Mr. Kennedy to make it. The doctors made the final decision and explained it to the family. Eunice listened, her face intent and set firm. Teddy stood by, wetting his lips and occasionally running his fingers through his hair. We knew that with his last ounce of strength, Mr. Kennedy would make the effort to attend the funeral if it was up to him. I believe the man would have laid down his life willingly in order to pay a last homage to his son, but apparently the doctors felt the risks were too great. There was also Mrs. Kennedy to consider. She was standing strong, but her strength had a breaking point, and the added tensions and concern that she would naturally feel regarding her husband's well-being might prove too much. No one ever told Mr. Kennedy of the decision. He sensed it and accepted it. During those terrible days, squadrons of guards were assigned to the compound, and security was increased, for no one knew whether or not a conspiracy existed. Fear mounted in us all. Was it a plot against the family? And if so, who would be next? And why? Then, like a shockwave, came the horrifying news that the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, had been murdered, shot down before the eyes of the nation. When Mrs. Kennedy was told, she let out a weird, high cry of, "My God, my God!" From that time on, the house existed in an eerie silence. The staff went about their chores with muted sorrow. No one cried. No one talked. Father Kavanaugh was still in bed. Eunice was a mainstay to her mother. She handled every detail. Teddy's presence was a great comfort, for he was a visible assurance that there were other sons strong enough to pick up the torch and carry it for their dead brother. Bobby was in Washington, but would phone several times a day, and Pat and Jean remained at the Capitol, assuming obligations that would otherwise have fallen on their mother's shoulders. The evening before the funeral, the family left Hyannisport for Washington. Mrs. Kennedy, Teddy, and Eunice came to tell Mr. Kennedy goodbye, and there were no displays of emotion. They informed him of the time of the funeral, in case he wanted to watch it on television, and he nodded solemnly to each one as they stooped to kiss him. I fought hard to hold back tears. When they left, he covered his eyes with the back of his hand and remained in that frozen position until he heard the motors of the Caroline signal as it flew over the compound. Captain Baird always used this means to let Mr. Kennedy know that all was well. He looked at me after the sound of the plane had disappeared into the night and motioned for me to turn down the lights. I knew then that regardless of the personal cost, he should have been going with his family. And had he been consulted as to his wishes, I know what his decision would have been. He had not watched television since he had heard the news from Teddy and Eunice, and had only briefly glanced at the paper that morning. I suppose there was nothing more for him to know. His son was gone, and the morbid details did not concern him. The room was blanketed in the soft shadows of twilight, and we sat together in silence. The next morning he refused his breakfast and would not get out of bed. We sat together watching the clock in silence. The hands limped the minutes away, and finally the hour came. I took his rosary from the nightstand and laid it in his hand. I pulled my chair near his bed. His eyes were closed, and his face was granite in its composure. "Shall I say the rosary, Mr. Kennedy?" He nodded faintly. So it was while a nation watched their president laid to rest with fitting pomp and ceremony. His father prayed alone, in a still and near-deserted house. Tragedy, like a black and evil bird of prey, hovered over the compound. Its giant wings cast a long, ominous shadow that was never again to be lifted. Mr. Kennedy remained alone for 2 days after the funeral. At that time, Mrs. Kennedy returned to the compound. The next afternoon, Teddy, Pat, Eunice, and Jean came home with their families for Thanksgiving, but Bobby and Ethel were not with them. Bobby had been so exhausted that he needed to get away from everything, so he went to Hobe Sound, Florida, with his family. It was a most peculiar homecoming. One could not tell from outer appearances that a son and brother had just been buried. Life picked up where it had left off, or so it seemed. But underneath the collective calm lay evidence of shattered hope and desperate sorrow. Teddy laughed louder than usual. Eunice was stiff and a bit more brittle in her attitude. Jean, always quiet, wore a stoic expression. Pat, who was always high-strung, became more on edge than ever. Mrs. Kennedy's shoulders seemed to sag, and the lines on her face appeared deeper. Unexpectedly on Thanksgiving Eve, word came that the First Lady had landed at Hyannis and would be arriving shortly. Everyone, even the family, was tense, awaiting her arrival. All of us wondered what we would say or do. Mr. Kennedy was not told, for they felt he would want to see her immediately, and everyone thought she would go straight to her own home and not join the family until Thanksgiving dinner, if then. I was sitting with him in his room when I heard her voice coming from downstairs. From the tone of it, she sounded aggravated and determined. I could not hear what was being said back to her, but her voice was louder than I had ever heard it. "I'm here to see Grandpa," she almost shouted. "No, I'm not upset. I'll rest after I see Grandpa. Please, please leave me alone. I'm fine. I just want to see Grandpa." Mr. Kennedy heard her, of course, and he motioned for me to find out what was going on. The First Lady sounded almost panicky, as if she were trying to pull away from someone. "She'll be here," I said. "She can handle it." He let out a deep, quivering sigh and shook his head woefully. I did not want to leave the room and get involved in a family situation. Obviously, someone was trying to convince her that she needed rest or that she could see Mr. Kennedy tomorrow. This, I'm sure, was being done with the best intentions and was in consideration for the tragedy she had just passed through, but Jacqueline Kennedy was a woman of strong conviction, and regardless of her own exhausted spirit, she was determined to see her father-in-law. She had given of herself willingly to the world during her tragedy and had fulfilled every obligation of state. Now she was home, and her first personal thought was of him. The scene downstairs got so loud that Mr. Kennedy again motioned for me to find out what was actually happening. Reluctantly, I went out into the hall and stood there for a moment, trying to decide what I should do. Just then, the First Lady came running up the stairs, alone. The last time I had seen her was just before she had been taken to Otis Hospital for the delivery of her son, Patrick. Patrick was their son that lived, I believe, for 2.5 or 3.5 days, and then he died. And that was the final tragedy that they shared together in regard to children. And it did bring Jack and Jackie closer together. I do not know what I expected. I suppose I felt she would carry a horrible and visible mark of her tragedy, but there were no changes in her at first glance. When she saw me, she ran down the length of the hall. "Mrs. Dallas," she cried. "Oh, Mrs. Dallas, I want to see Grandpa." "He's waiting," I replied. Her eyes seemed to be frozen, and her shoulders, usually so straight, slumped a bit. But she was still the same Jacqueline Kennedy, and I realized that the wounds were too new for the scars to show. In her arms, she had a furled flag, and as she stood before me, her voice dropped to its familiar, gentle whisper. "May I see him?" Of course. I think he's been waiting for you all along." She stopped outside his door and stood for a moment in deep thought. She cradled the flag, then embraced it. Holding it close, she said, "Mrs. Dallas, this is Grandpa's." She handed it to me, and her hand lingeringly gave it a final caress. "It was Jack's." I nodded. "I want you to keep it, and when I leave, please will you give it to him? I can't, Mrs. Dallas, but I want him to have it. It's his. Will you give it to him for me after I'm gone?" I nodded again, for I was too choked to speak. "And please," she said, "one more thing. Come in with me while I talk to you. We both want you." I followed her and laid the flag on the dresser behind a stack of papers. Mr. Kennedy did not notice, for he was welcoming her with his outstretched arms. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they embraced. "Oh, Grandpa," she whispered, "I'm so glad that I'm here with you. I've been so worried. Are you all right?" He nodded yes. She pulled up a low footstool and sat down beside his bed. They were at eye level. She took his hand in hers and studied it thoughtfully. "Grandpa," she said solemnly, "Jack's gone, and nothing will ever be the same for us again. He's gone, and I want to tell you about it." What's interesting about this, I think we're about to get a little peek at this, but Jackie apparently was in a cycle. What we read in The Death of a President was that she was just in a cycle of wanting to retell the story to anyone who would listen. And that was part of, I think, her getting her grasp on what had happened. You know, grief does funny things. It's interesting the way that it described earlier in the chapter him just staring off into space. I have been there. I don't know if you have been there, but where something seems so shocking and so grievous that it's almost like your brain can't receive it. And even once you've heard it and maybe you've had the initial cry of shock, but then everything just stops and you can't hardly put any words to it. You're just numb and in shock. It seems that part of her shock was repeatedly telling the story and trying to, I think, her brain trying to make any sense of it. Her voice never wavered, and I shall always marvel at how so young a woman could cope with reliving and retelling in total detail the most harrowing experience of her life. She began with the day that they had left Washington for Texas, and she told him everything through to the final service and burial. His eyes never left her face, and she never faltered. She would caress his hand or hold it tightly from time to time, and when she finished, she stood up, straightened the covers over him, and kissed him good night. "I'm going home now, Grandpa. I'm very tired, but I'll be over tomorrow to have Thanksgiving dinner with you." She bent over him again and closed both eyelids with kisses. "Sleep well, dear Grandpa," she said. "Sleep well." That's a really interesting moment for Mrs. Dallas, the nurse, to get to witness, this moment of the complete telling by Jackie. So far, we've only been told about close intimates being put in that position. So we're talking about Bobby, and I think Robert McNamara was one that got that early telling. But in her desire to tell Joe Kennedy, Mrs. Dallas got to sit in on that telling. I mean, sometimes we use the phrase, "Wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall in that room?" But I feel that the horror of that, of course, my curiosity would want to hear what Jackie had to say. But also I can't help but feel that in her respectful telling of that moment, she doesn't give details, but she talks about the total detail of the most harrowing experience of her life. That would be quite a thing to be privy to. I had been standing near the door, almost in the same spot where I had waited while Teddy and Eunice told him his son had been killed, and as she slipped quietly past me, she took my arm and said, "Walk to the head of the stairs with me." As she started to leave, she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Dallas. Being with us made it easier." Then her tired eyes looked into mine, and she spoke softly, "Is Grandpa doing all right?" "He's doing well." Did he see it on television? No, he didn't want it that way. Did he read the papers? He glanced at the front page that first morning, but that was the only time. Then perhaps you were right. Perhaps he was waiting to hear it from me. Oh, thank God I came. She brushed her hand across her forehead. I'm so tired, so very tired, she said. I need rest, but I'll be over in the morning. And if you will, please let me know when you've given him the flag. I will tonight, if he's still awake, otherwise in the morning, but I'll call you. Thank you, she smiled wanly. I watched her as she slowly descended the stairs, her hand dragging on the banister, and I have never seen a woman who looked so alone. I went back to Mr. Kennedy and found him awake, staring thoughtfully at the ceiling. I brought the flag to him. The First Lady wants you to have your son's flag, I said. I laid it beside him, and he ran his fingers over the tightly folded triangle in deep meditation. In a moment, he motioned for me to put it on his desk. I felt his eyes following me as I laid it down gently and reverently. He leaned his head back on his pillow and closed his eyes. I sat down in a chair I always kept near the foot of the bed and waited until I knew he had fallen into a deep sleep. The night nurse took her vigil, and after one last look at Mr. Kennedy, I left for my home. Like him, I was also soon asleep. That's one of the things of being a caregiver, isn't it? Is that you have the concern for the person that you're caring for, and then also there's that monitoring of how am I actually doing? Am I making sure I'm eating, sleeping, attending to my own stressors? This is a very interesting account, isn't it? Are you feeling it? I just feel very grateful to be reading this with you right now. And very grateful that this impetus of Kennedy Weeks brought it to our attention and gave me the motivation to go ahead and read it with you, because I'm enjoying these little snippets. We just have a few more pages left together. At 2 a.m, my phone rang. It was the night nurse telling me to come quick. All I got from her was that Mr. Kennedy was in a state of panic, and when I rushed to his room, I was horrified at the wild, terrified expression on his face. I was given the following story from the nurse. According to her, Mr. Kennedy had slept soundly. Anne had gone into his room quite late, saying that she was going to tuck him in, which she often did. After a while, she came back out and went to her room. The night nurse settled down at the desk in the nurse's station and kept her ear close to the intercom because we were all quite concerned about Mr. Kennedy during this period of deep grief. A few minutes before 2 o'clock, she was startled when she heard Mr. Kennedy screaming. She rushed in and found him lying in bed, stiff with terror, his eyes wide in fear. Draped over his bed like a blanket was the flag that had lain on his son's casket. Apparently, Anne had covered him with it when she had gone in before. Later, when he awakened and in the dim glow of the nightlight realized what was over him, he went to pieces. He was so distraught that I spent most of the night attempting to calm him down. The next morning, Anne was bewildered by the distress her gesture had caused him when we told her what had happened. No one else knew about the incident, and the flag hung in the living room for a while until Mrs. Kennedy had to take it down because it bothered her so much. It was put away, and several years later, when it was requested for the Kennedy Museum, it seemed to be lost, and it took all of us days of searching before it was found. Thanksgiving Day came bright and crisp, and had always been the custom. The family celebrated it together. It was dismal enough facing the loss of the president, but to have Bobby spending the holidays away from the family made it even more desolate. Apparently, the death of the president and the difficult responsibilities of carrying out his office as the Attorney General had proved too much for him. It was reported there was an incident at the birthday party the First Lady gave for young John at the White House the day after the funeral that finally broke him down. Yeah, the day after the funeral was John's birthday. Or was it the funeral day? I can't remember, one or the other, but they ended up having a little party for John in the White House because the First Lady wanted it to still be a special day for him. even amidst all of the grieving. It says they were gathered around, arms draped across each other's shoulders, and someone started to sing, "Heart of My Heart," one of the Kennedys' favorites. Bobby fled from the room completely shattered, and it was decided for his own good that he needed a few days away to himself. Many people, even those closely associated with the family, found it impossible to rationalize their apparent lack of sorrow at the president's death. There was a great deal of criticism by the staff when they all gathered on the front lawn and played a boisterous game of touch football after Thanksgiving dinner. Mrs. Kennedy took her usual walk, and it was almost as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I met the governess of Teddy's children as she was driving off the compound. I waved at her, for she was always a pleasant, friendly woman who seemed extremely proficient in her position. She stopped her car, and in contrast with her usual calm demeanor, her face was tense. "This is goodbye, Mrs. Dallas. I'm leaving." "What?" "I've quit the senator." "I don't believe it. Why?" Her voice livid with anger, she said, "Enough is enough. The president was just buried, Mrs. Dallas, and the senator had the gall to have a gang of so-called friends in last night. I never saw anything like it. They stayed up all night laughing and drinking. They actually made a game of seeing who could tell the most outlandish stories about the president and the family. It was the most disgusting spectacle I've ever witnessed, and I'll not work another day for that heartless man." "Oh, please," I said, hoping to soothe her. "The senator wasn't being heartless. He was having his own wake for his brother. Haven't you ever heard of an Irish wake?" "I don't care what you call it. I've resigned, and I never intend to work another day for such people. I let him know that I thought he was thoroughly disgusting." She drove off, incensed. I am Irish, and was able to understand what Teddy was doing. However, I admit I understood the feelings of the governess because I also had been taken aback a bit when I watched them throw themselves into the game of touch football with such vigor and good humor as if nothing had happened. There is no doubt that we Irish are a mysterious and peculiar people. Perhaps the only way to endure an unbearable loss is to find some kind of mirth. We had some friends who had lived abroad, and we got to know them when we were considering moving abroad. And they told us at some point about how hard it was to live through culture shock. And they gave us the counsel that a lot of times you're either laughing or crying, and so you might as well laugh. That was their counsel, as they tried to look for the good humor in difficult circumstances. And I do think there is something for me that comes up of, it's not a macabre humor, it's more like the body raucous appreciation of the person who passed that doesn't always come up, but I think sometimes, like I think of one particular person that was close to me that passed, and I did think about some of the funny jokes that we told together and the ways that we would laugh at what the children were doing or various things like that. And I do think there's something about death that can also bring us closer to the joys that we shared with that person and bring those things dearer and nearer to us, where we might be more apt to smile and laugh, but with a deep wistfulness in our hearts. And I think part of that is in the shock moment where you're not yet fully experiencing the full range of emotions that will come once you sit in the quiet with the actual death. But I wouldn't want to see somebody laughing it up with buddies and playing football. So I understand these sentiments, but I also do understand like that grief is weird and it doesn't always look the way other people think it should look. To read the last sentence, she says, "Perhaps the only way to endure an unbearable loss is to find some kind of mirth. Such was the case on Thanksgiving weekend when Cardinal Cushing called and said he would be up for a visit with his old friend Joe. When he arrived at the house, Anne and Mrs. Kennedy were in Mr. Kennedy's room, and we could hear the Cardinal's booming voice carrying all the way up from the living room. 'I've come,' he roared, 'to repeat the eulogy for Joe. I'm redoing it in its entirety.'" "Oh, Lord, no!" Mrs. Kennedy shrieked as she scampered from the room. "Tell him I'm not doing well. Tell him I'm in my room. Tell him anything." Anne, laughing, was hot on her aunt's heels. "Rita, it's all yours." I looked at Mr. Kennedy, and he was shaking the bed, laughing. So they don't want to hear the whole sermon again. And they're all finding it funny, apparently. They're like trying to get out of having to hear the cardinal's sermon, I think. "We're hooked," I said. "Lord help us, we're hooked." Just then, the cardinal burst into the room. "Joe," he shouted with his arms outstretched. "Joe, Joe, Joe, I've come." Mr. Kennedy raised his hand in a warm wave, trying hard to keep his lips from twitching. "Joe, the eulogy was magnificent, absolutely magnificent." Everyone in the family idolized the cardinal, for he was a dear man with a charming grace and humor, but he had a voice that would defy description, and once heard, it could never be forgotten. Without any preliminary, he took out a sheaf of papers, cleared his throat like a clap of thunder, and with all the majesty and volume that he had conjured at the services in Washington, he roared out the eulogy, word for word. I was grateful that Mr. Kennedy kept his eyes pasted to the ceiling through the oratory, for had he looked at me, I know I would have shamed my Catholic heritage forever by spouting laughter all over the good cardinal's eulogy. Mr. Kennedy kept his mouth pressed in a tight, serious line, but I could see the edges twitching as he fought to control himself. Finally, the cardinal finished. He folded up his papers elegantly and boomed, "Well, Joe, didn't I tell you it was magnificent?" Mr. Kennedy could no longer control himself and burst out laughing. Fortunately, the cardinal took it as one of Joe's situations and was not hurt or upset. I, however, ducked out of the room as the cardinal was shouting, "Laughter is good for the soul, dear Joe. Indeed, yes." I saw Mrs. Kennedy peeking around her bedroom door, and she crooked her finger, motioning for me. "He's finished," she whispered. I had held back my laughter so long that my eyes were watering. "Yes," I sputtered. "Well then," she said, grandly opening the door, "I must take this opportunity to welcome the cardinal." She started to her husband's room, then stopped and looked over her shoulder. It's really funny because Rose Kennedy is deemed to be like the super Catholic. So it's interesting that she would want to avoid hearing her cardinal reading a meaningful eulogy. I guess they were just over it and also just didn't want to sit and listen to a sermon at that particular moment. But it's just interesting because you hear so much about her religious rituals and the things that kind of guided her life. And I would have, before this moment, I would have thought that would have been something that she would have wanted to hear. "You're really sure he's finished, Mrs. Dallas?" I nodded, just as Anne tiptoed down the hall. "Is it over?" We both took a fit of laughing. "Poor Uncle Joe," she said, wiping her eyes. "Poor Uncle Joe, my eye. Poor Uncle Joe and Rita Dallas. You two really left us flat." The cardinal was one of Mr. Kennedy's dearest friends, so I felt my laughter was venial. It was, however, days before I could get the picture of Anne and Mrs. Kennedy scampering out of the room and the dear cardinal, oblivious to everything and everyone, leaning over Mr. Kennedy, reenacting the entire eulogy at the top of his voice. His visit was good medicine for Mr. Kennedy, and the fact that he was able to respond to humor gave me assurance that he would be able to cope with his great loss. The cardinal was correct when he had said laughter is good for the soul. A few days later, Mr. Kennedy was able to make the flight to Palm Beach for the winter season without incident, and it was not until Ham Brown came to say goodbye that he fell back into a blue and desolate mood. With the president's death, the government could no longer provide an agent as his bodyguard, so Ham was being reassigned. We all got the full impact after he left. The direct line to the White House was removed, and the White House trailer was taken away. The presidential flag was taken down, and the Honey Fitz sailed out of the blue Florida waters. As each day passed, we became more acutely aware that the Kennedys were no longer the first family. At that time, Jacqueline Kennedy made a permanent decision about her children, and that was to guard their right to privacy with a fierce and determined fervor. Had she not done this, I doubt if Caroline could have coped with life as well as she has. The widow did not attempt to compensate her daughter's loss in any superficial way, and she never grew lax in her training and discipline. She succeeded in providing her daughter and her son with a life they could accept without interference. And today, when I read that she is still vigilant and constant in her determination to keep them from the limelight, I know that only a woman with her inner strength could have waged such a formidable battle. Caroline was shattered by her father's murder, and she became a pitiful little girl in her grief. She seemed to age before our eyes. She stayed to herself, lost in thought, and her eyes, once so pert and dancing, were listless and stared into a bleak nothingness. Children seldom clenched their fists, but her tiny hands were always knotted. She toyed with her food, and the special desserts that had always tempted her were pushed away. This child was at a crucial age, but like the rest of us, she could not rationalize why anyone would have wanted to destroy him. I have to say, I don't know that I love how that chapter ended. She basically lauds Jackie Kennedy for protecting Caroline's privacy and then proceeds to give a little description of Caroline in those years. So anyway, but what did you notice about the chapter? I thought the part about seeing the family being silly about Cardinal Cushing's sermon or eulogy was very interesting. It kind of gave us a personal look at the family and how they were just not up for everything. They were not in it to please the cardinal. And also the idea of the Irish wake, the assistant leaving. Very interesting details here in this chapter. Let me know what stood out to you. I look forward to hearing in the comments, and we will talk about these things next time. We will be getting into the Robert F. Kennedy years, his lead up to his presidential race, and then, of course, his assassination as well. So come back for that. We'll see you then. Have a great day. Bye.